Welcome back. Let's pause in the presence of God, opening our hearts to Him. Here's a prayer that's inspired by life on Holy Island. Holy Island is a tidal island, so when the tide is out, then you can actually walk across on a causeway to the island, and when the tide is in, the tide covers that causeway, becomes an island. So there's this sense of in and out. Let's quiet our hearts. Grant to me, Lord, joy in giving, joy in receiving, love incoming, love outflowing, peace instilling, peace distilling, wisdom infilling, wisdom outpouring. Grant to me, O Lord, a rhythm of life, God, whom my life sanctified, Jesus Christ, who death defied, Spirit, ever at my side, from inflowing to ebb tide, from ebbing to inflowing tide, ever with me abide. Amen. Today we look at John 1 verse 14. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. There's so many ways of thinking about just that little verse. Jesus, the eternal one, the cosmic Christ, the one who existed from the beginning of time and before, comes into our world as a tiny bundle of flesh, limits himself to the size of a vulnerable child. It's almost as though Jesus is taking up our flesh, and where we've lowered our existence as human beings, lost our humanity, actually our true selves, as we talked about yesterday, he then picks up this flesh and elevates it back to where it should always have been, by living a life and showing us what's possible as a human. Then the phrase made his dwelling among us is also translated, he tabernacled among us. I guess that would be an older English way of describing it. But that word there, he made his dwelling among us, it really does talk about tabernacle. And of course, in the Old Testament, if you wanted to find the presence of God, then you would go to the tabernacle, and then later that tabernacle became the temple when Solomon finally built a temple in Jerusalem. If you wanted to find the presence of God, that's where you would find the presence of God. That's where heaven met earth, at the tabernacle, at the temple. And that language is stolen here by the Apostle John as he gives us the gospel. And he says, Jesus tabernacled among us. He moved his dwelling among us. He moved right in. So the place where you would find God was right here, Jesus. This is the place, right at Jesus, where heaven meets earth. And in a more modern translation, that phrase is actually translated, Jesus moved into the neighbourhood. It reminds me so much of the story of Aidan, one of the ancient Celtic saints, who was the Bishop of Holy Island in the 7th century. So we'll just touch on some of the highlights of Aidan's story. Oswald had become king of Northumbria in battle as usual. And he had asked the monks from Iona, a tiny little island off the west coast of Scotland, to send a team to Northumbria to bring the Christian gospel to his people, Oswald's people, in Northumbria. Corman was quite a fierce guy and a bit of a battler himself, although he was a monk in Iona. So Corman was the guy that was chosen and was sent to Northumbria to preach the gospel. It was actually only after a few months that Corman returned back to Iona and complained, really, that the Angles that he had been sent to were brutish, they didn't speak Latin, they were only really interested in battles and in dividing the spoils. There was no hope for them as far as Corman was concerned. Well, Aidan was in the body of monks listening to Corman's report, and he couldn't believe what he was hearing, really. They had been invited as a body of monks to send a team by the king of Northumbria who wanted the gospel to be preached to his people. And here, after a few months of trying, Corman's returning saying it's a hopeless case. So Aidan fairly boldly, after asking some questions of Corman as to what had actually gone on, Aidan says this: "Brother, it seems to me that you were too hard on these untaught minds. You expected too much too soon. You should have followed the example of the apostles and begun by giving them the milk of simple teaching, gradually instructing them until they were able to accept more. You cannot force people to be where you want them to be without showing them what they are missing by remaining as they are." Quite strong words from Aidan, really. Now, Aidan was actually known as a very gentle monk and a really generous monk. So many in Iona thought that he was not the man that should be sent to go and preach the gospel to a bunch of warriors. But it turns out that's exactly what they needed. With Aidan's fairly strong challenge to Corman, he got the opportunity and was commissioned to go and say, well, you give it a try. So Aidan comes, gentle, generous, ready to learn the language of the locals, respecting the traditions and the culture that he saw in the world around him, and refusing to take any status that the king offered him, like riding on a horse. He wanted to be down with the locals. And gently, Aidan introduced the gospel of Christ alongside the lives that the Angles were already living. So today, as we pause to contemplate, let's ask ourselves a couple of questions. Are there cultural differences in my locality that offend me? And secondly, how could I take another step to move into the neighbourhood where I am? Lord, help us to value all human life equally. Open our eyes to any unhelpful, unconscious bias that we still carry. And show us, Lord, where we can be a useful neighbour. Amen. We continue the journey tomorrow. See you then.